Welcome to Cycling Demystified and a special series of podcasts on the 10 essential pillars of bike fitting. We had such a good response from a recent webinar we did on this subject and so many questions that we thought we would dive deeper into the 10 pillars and bring you a podcast episode for each of them. We've dedicated an entire episode to each of the essential pillars so that you can take the exact same proven methods we use in our bike fit sessions and apply them to your own bike fit. Hopefully this will be particularly useful for those riders who can't make it over to our studio in London. We'll be releasing 2 episodes each week, one on Monday and one on Thursday. Follow along in sequence and you'll be able to build your bike fit up in the same order as we do in our studio sessions. As always, if you have any questions off the back of this series, get in touch. We want to hear from you and we'll help you find that amazing bike fit you've been looking for. So grab a seat, cup of tea and tune in so that we can share the knowledge we've accrued over thousands and thousands of bike fits. Probably the most overlooked of all the variables that will make the biggest impact to your overall fit, neglected by the industry and therefore not considered by the majority or riders and fitters as a critical part of their bike fit and long-term health. This is a big topic, so we've broken crank length into 2 separate episodes. Part A covers what is crank length, what does it affect, why you should care, and why it's been overlooked. Part B covers the benefits, will you lose power, and the method to test for your ideal crank length.
Welcome back to Cycling Demystified and the 10 pillars of bike fit. This week we are talking about crank length, part 8, I think, part 8 within the 10-part series, and this one's going to be a meaty one. So we have Ev.
What? I've been away for several episodes.
Yeah, welcome back.
Been building up
Bring back
my sense of humour.
Yes. Shall I say it again? It's going to be a meaty one. And we're going to separate it out into 2 different episodes just because there's so much to talk about. So the first half we're going to talk about what crank length is, what does it affect, why we should care about it, why the bike industry has overlooked this, and probably why everyone else has overlooked this as an essential part of your bike fit, and how this is slowing us all down. How crank length should be approached for different disciplines. And then the second part, which will come out later, is going to talk about the benefits of crank length, what it affects in terms of how our bodies operate, and what we can seek to gain from experimenting with those crank lengths. And everything else in between. And as always, if you have any questions, send them in. Let us know. We want to hear about it. We want to hear all the questions that you have. And yeah, hopefully that will we'll give you some practical tips as to how you can start to experiment with your crank length, or just determine how or why or if you should be experimenting with your crank length at all. And after that, we'll move on to part 9, which is all about saddles. So, after that lengthy intro, let's crack in.
Matt, what is it?
Oh, weren't you supposed to do that, Ev? You're the mechanic. Tell us all about crank.
What's a crank? What's a crank? Everyone
What's
knows
a
what a
crank?
crank is, right?
No.
It's a scientist that doesn't study. It's the bits, the turny bits, the bits that the pedals plug into. That's the crank.
The lever.
The lever that you
that
turn with your
connects
feet.
the pedal.
You want to be
the
scientific
chainring.
about it, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Now over to you. What does it affect? Why should we care?
Well, it affects everything.
What? You're blowing my mind.
Yeah. It literally affects everything because it predominantly affects your hips.
Right.
And the hips are like essentially the center of your bike.
Okay.
Or you on the bike.
Right.
If you get your pelvis in a happy place, everything else is happy.
So they say in yoga, it's the seat of your power.
Exactly.
And, you know, if, is it Shakira? Hips don't lie?
True say.
There you go.
We like
Yeah.
that song.
You know, happy hips, happy bike riders.
But no, it affects everything, from the way you stabilize yourself on the bike, the way you transfer force through the bike,
Yeah.
the way you cover distance from the saddle to the handlebars, the way you interact with the saddle. It affects your symmetry on the bike as well.
Yeah.
Like, are you kind of sat wonky on the saddle? All that kind of stuff. Do you have a preference, left or right? It literally affects everything. And
it affects one of the things that most people like understand, which is where you put your saddle.
yeah, it affects
Right.
where your saddle is in space. And it can have an effect on, like a detrimental effect or a positive effect on just generally the way you function on a bike, which we'll get into later because that's one of my favourite things to talk about. But yeah, so in short, it affects everything about your bike position. And if we overlook this area of your bike position, then you are potentially leaving a ton of stuff on the table in terms of comfort, efficiency, and power and aerodynamics as well. You know, if that's stuff you care about.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on that can be affected with your crank length, and yeah, it's one of the most important things of your bike fit.
Yeah, I think it's also probably one of the trickiest things to experiment with, which does contribute to the reason why it is less explored than why
There's a
we'd-
cataclysm of cause and effect when you change your cranks.
Yeah, like and I think probably because the crank is the most dynamic part of your bike fit, is literally the bit that is turning
Yeah.
all the time
Yeah.
and in motion. Whereas the rest of your body we tend to think about as being rather static and fixed. Like the crank system and your legs and your feet and your knees are always going around. And so in some ways it's a little bit more difficult to assess because there's so much happening all at once. But once you actually kind of delve into it as a system of levers, then it does become a bit simpler and so on. So yeah, we could start there and talking about it as a kind of system of levers and kind of what effect that has. And there's plenty of good videos online as well. People have kind of drawn up like biomechanical models of crank lengths and things like that. Actually, I think Matt.
Shout out to Matt Appleman,
Yeah, he's got a
our
really-
Lord and Saviour with our cranks. If you don't know who he is, no.
Yeah.
Google him.
Yeah.
He's got a really good like GIF illustration of like kind of how different crank lengths affect kind of body positions, things like that. But I think even before we go there, like historically, I think the industry as well has been very slow to realise the effects.
Slow.
Of
The industry.
Cycling demystified.
Well, I never.
Another industry rant. Surely not.
Why? Why would they do this?
Well, I think some of it is to do with the kind of accessibility of cycling now. As cycling as a sport has grown, and so there's more different types of people coming into the sport. Lots of different body shapes and body sizes, different disciplines, people riding in different ways, and quite often, like we talk a lot about road cycling, and we do see mostly road cyclists. But there's so many more disciplines out there now. But crank length originally was kind of built around road cyclists predominantly. And for some reason, I don't know, Campagnolo decided that 170mm cranks was like, just the way to go. Probably after a bit of experimentation and so on. But, they just kind of decided
The
that
Italians
once-
experimenting.
I mean, to arrive at a number.
There'd have been some thought put into it,
Yeah.
maybe.
How high the curb was.
But that kind of, just that number has just kind of stuck around. And if you look at the variations of crank lengths that are available, you'll see that they're very small. And the increments in which they're available in are pretty small too. So probably the most common crank lengths are 170 and 172.5 millimeters long. A long crank would be considered 175 millimeters, and a short crank would be considered 165.
Which is
millimeters.
wild, because there's only 10 mils of difference. And if you think about the range in people that
Yeah.
that has to cover,
Yeah.
people who are 5 foot tall or less,
Yeah.
and they're riding like tiny bikes that are like, you know, proportionate to their
Yeah.
body shape, and then you've got like people who are like, you know, in the NBA or whatever, 2 meters plus tall,
Yeah.
and there's only a 10 millimeter width of crank length choice
Yeah.
for that entire demographic.
I mean, most bike manufacturers will offer more range of different sizes of bike
But with the same
relative
length
to like
cranks
crank
on it,
length.
yeah.
There's only like we're talking about like the most common crank lengths that are available from the big manufacturers. And granted, this is
But they
changing slowly.
They do the same with handlebars.
yeah,
They
Yeah.
do the same with saddles.
Stems.
Like they sell stems. They sell,
Yeah.
you know, they sell every one of their bikes with basically the same saddle,
yeah,
Yeah.
which
But,
is, you know, one's not
You know,
necessarily-
out of all the different variables on the bike, so stem lengths, like stem
Yeah.
lengths come in like so many more kind of variation. They come in 10 mil increments all the way from like 50 mil to 150 mil. So
and that's just mainstream stuff.
That's just
mainstream
road
stuff.
Yeah.
You know, saddle setbacks come from like 0 to like 25. Handlebar widths go from like 36 to 44.
22, mate.
Yeah, I'm just talking mainstream stuff.
So basically, what we can assess from this is that the cycling industry does not have your best interests at heart.
No, it generally has overlooked crank length and crank length choice as an important part of your bike fit and how your experience of bike riding. Even though it is the most dynamic and probably the most important part of your bike fit, in that, you know, it is there to kind of power your bike forward. Like without the cranks, you can't do anything. But yeah, you know, like, we can moan about the industry
We do, often.
all day long. But there are, despite all those moans, you know, cranks do come in many, many different lengths. So again, our friend Matt Appleman over in the States makes cranks all the way from 100 millimeters all the way up to, well, as long as you want, 200 probably.
Wow.
And, you know, like, obviously if you buy a kid's bike, then it's going to have like tiny little cranks on it and so on. But there are options out there. Rotor as well, great brand, who make a great variety of different cranks and chain rings and all the rest of it. Accrued have been making kind of shorter cranks too. So there are like lots of brands out there. You just got to, they're just not that mainstream. You've got to kind of look out for them. You've got to put some research in. And so, you know, bike fitters are usually more cognizant of like the options out there. And without that knowledge, if you didn't know that there were different options out there, you wouldn't bother choosing. So some of this is just kind of ignorance. Bliss is ignorance. Ignorance is bliss. Sorry. Yeah. So that was a little rant about the industry and like kind of why crank length has been overlooked.
So if I've got long legs, do I need to ride long cranks?
Well,
Which part of your leg is long?
QI buzzer going
Yeah.
off.
So we need to get a button.
We need to get a buzzer. But this is the thing, right? And this is like one of a common misconception about crank length is that it's purely down to the length of your leg.
yeah. I mean, well, let's talk about what a crank does and how does that actually power a bike along. Oh, I said the power word.
The P word.
You can't know the power. Sorry.
So from a mechanical sense, you know, it is a lever, and so we can apply the laws of physics to it.
But it's part of a system of levers.
It's part of a system of levers.
Starting
So I'm
at
jumping the
your
gun
hip,
here, aren't I?
right?
Yeah.
Go
Go on, you go.
Calm down, Matt. Calm.
Sorry.
Calm down.
But essentially, we apply force downwards on the pedals, which are attached to the cranks, and that allows us to kind of turn the series of gears on our bikes, and that kind of in turn turns the wheels, and that allows us to kind of move forward. Now you can affect how quickly you move by changing a few different variables. So you can either turn that kind of crank arm faster, and so you can
Increase your cadence.
increase the cadence, and so the wheel goes around faster, and so you can go forward. You can have a longer lever, and therefore apply more torque, and therefore turn the wheel a further distance by pushing on that kind of longer lever arm.
In a bigger gear.
In a bigger gear, and then
So that
using
you
a bigger
can-
gear,
yeah.
so you can again affect it. So there's a few different ways, there's 3 different ways that you can affect like kind of how quickly you go, and this is essentially what we're trying to do on the bike. As we're trying to power it along, we're using that kind of crank arm to kind of power us along. However, we also need to think about, the crank arm kind of essentially allows us to place our feet. So also, as well as generating the force to power us along, it has to stabilize our bodies. We use those crank arms as a platform to kind of balance upon. So it's actually quite tricky. Like, we have to balance ourselves whilst creating force. And this is where the kind of nuance of a lot of our bike fitting comes in, is trying to maintain as much force on the pedals as easily as possible without losing a lot of that stability and balance that we have on the bike. And so, we should, that's the kind of framework that we're looking at, and that's what we're trying to achieve on the bike. Now, if you've got different disciplines of cycling will require different amounts of those variables. So, if your priorities for like a triathlon or TT position will be very different to a mountain biking position, which will be different to kind of road, to gravel, to track, and so on. So, should we get into some of that?
Yeah.
Or was
So I think it's like, what would be kind of the use case for different length cranks in terms of disciplines, and what cause and effects does that have on the body, but also on moving the bike forward?
Yeah. So, like on my mountain bike, I've got 175 cranks. On my road bike, I've got 165 cranks. On my TT bike, I've got 155 cranks.
He's got all the cranks.
Textbook, mate.
Textbook.
Textbook.
Just
Just
got
wanted
all the
all
cranks.
the cranks.
So why do you have the longer cranks on your mountain bike?
Justify your decision.
Yeah. Was it because they were cheap?
So a longer lever. It's just what they came with. Though I have been experimenting with 170 cranks on the mountain bike.
Okay. That's what I've got on my mountain bike, which is long-ish for me,
Yeah.
because on my road bike it's 165.
Yeah.
So
So when you're riding off-road, the discipline requires you to maneuver over varied terrain, tricky obstacles.
And we're talking actually riding a mountain bike, not sending it down a hill in a bike park.
Yeah.
Actually
like
pedaling.
cross-country riding,
Yeah, actually
mountain
pedaling,
biking.
yeah.
Pedaling. Yeah. When you actually have to pedal.
old
a
school mountain biking.
Yeah.
But
Like they
that's
used to
quite
do.
good. There's 2 different sides of that equation that we're just talking about, like stability versus power production. And downhill mountain biking, get the lift up to the top, you send it down the hill, you barely have to pedal, so you're just pushing the bike down. But your pedals, like that crank arm, has to be super stable, because you're going over the roughest terrain at the quickest speed possible coming at you.
Well, interestingly, there's a trend very much now towards shorter cranks for more, I think, what they would call gravity
Yeah.
disciplines of mountain biking. So like downhill, things like that. Because of that element of stability. If your feet are closer together, as in not as far away in a split stance, then you're increasing the stability that you have when you're sending it.
That's interesting, because I would have said the opposite is also true. Because when you are...
How could it be also true?
Well, because two things can be true at the same time. If you've got your feet further apart from each other, it's like, if you're standing, you want to have better balance. If you put your feet close together, you've got less. Someone can push you over easier, right? Whereas if your feet are further apart,
but there's a tipping point of where you can go too far apart.
Yeah, of course.
Where you lose that stability.
Yeah, but you can also, you're not on a solid platform, right? Because you can move your cranks. So isn't there a case to be? Because I would.
I'm going to hang fire on this because when we get to talk about
I want you to haze
which
me.
I'm pointing at the board
yeah.
for the listeners that can't see, absolutely tear you a new one.
That's what I'm waiting for. Well, so anyway, back to my point. I would have assumed, because I always assumed that the reason that shorter cranks are preferable as a trend in gravity riding is rock strikes.
That as well. Yeah, that
So
helps.
not wanting to clip a pedal on something that will just appear out of nowhere, a tree root or a massive rock.
Yeah.
That has always been in my head when I've thought, okay, off-road, shorter cranks will prevent some of that maybe from happening.
So I think this came from Hope. So Hope started producing like
155 cranks.
155 cranks. And the idea is that your center of gravity is kind of closer to the middle of the bike. And if the bike's designed to be kind of most planted and most stable in the middle of the bike, and you can sit into the bike, then you're more stable. But I also get your point of like, if you've got your feet further apart, actually I think it's more about control.
Yeah.
So you can...
Your ability to shift your center of gravity by moving your body back and forth and having essentially a wider platform, as in front and back, to be able to do
But
that.
if you think about like a motorbike, like a trials bike, like a motorbike, your feet are dead level.
Yes.
And that is a very stable, very controllable platform.
However, a motorbike is much, much, much heavier than a bicycle.
But even like on a push bike, on like a trials push bike,
Yeah.
the cranks are generally like pretty short.
Yeah, true.
So
You told me.
So this is why like crank length is really tricky. We've already covered just in the discipline of like mountain biking, how stability, how power production, how rock strikes, how center of gravity is all affected by.
Well, here's my other reason for. I would assume that you had longer cranks on a mountain bike or a kind of off-road bike is to have a higher, the ability to do a higher torque at a very, very low cadence to get over. Because, like, with an off-road, with mountain bike, with gravel, sometimes with cross or whatever, you might get to a point where you're practically stopped dead, and then you basically have to go up like two steps at a time, kind of thing, with a big push at a very, very low cadence.
Yeah, so generally that's why off-road kind of bikes will have a slightly longer crank length relative to their kind of road-bearing cousins. Because you do need that initial, that kind of fast kind of burst,
high
torque power to be able to kind of generate that speed quickly to get over an obstacle.
But it's still relative to the rider. So, like, for me, 170 is long. For you, 175. For for Matt,
160.
160 is long.
But then on a mountain bike, you can deal with a slightly longer crank because you've got a more upright body position. Everything's
your knees aren't going to hit your chest necessarily,
and everything's geared more around being able to handle and steer the bike. As opposed to the opposite, being like a aero TT position where you're trying to make your body as small as possible and as still as possible. So yeah,
So crank length affects everything.
Yeah.
As we said.
yeah, crank length
Yeah.
affects everything. And so let's go to the opposite. So what are the priorities for like an aerodynamic position, and why would we choose the kind of crank lengths that we choose there?
So about triathlon or time trialing?
Let's talk about both. Let's
Alright.
go time trialing, because like that's kind of further from like downhill mountain biking.
Wait, there's a difference between triathlon and time trialing.
My goodness.
Uh-oh.
My goodness.
I told you this one was going to be a long one. Okay, TT positions, Matt.
All right, so it's the Olympics 2012. We're all running 180 mil cranks. Front ends as low as they can go.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, so if your aim is to go as fast as possible on your time trial or triathlon, well, go time trial first. You don't have to worry about running. So you might be able to go a little bit longer than you maybe would for a triathlon. But effectively, what you're trying to do is make your body as small as possible, so there's the least amount of you for the wind to see, whilst maintaining maximal force production for the duration of your event. That's essentially what a time trial is. Get from A to B as fast as possible, whilst making yourself as small as possible and putting out as much force as possible.
Yeah.
So for a time trial, time trial positions have changed a lot. The Giro's on at the moment. There's some absolutely wild time trial positions, which I won't go into. But yeah, if we think about kind of like time trial in 20, 30 years ago, what was it? Zwift brought out the Big Mig Pinarello TT bike from like 1992.
Did they?
Man's nose was on the front wheel. It was so low.
Yeah.
But
well, 650 wheel at
yeah,
the front, 700 at the back.
Yeah, like the reverse, was it a reverse mullet?
Yeah.
Yeah. Man's ahead of his time. But, he was basically like bent over so far, there's so much stress on his hips, but he's probably putting out a ton of torque.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of power going on there, and, his frontal area was pretty small. Nowadays, we know a lot more about how the body works. Cranks are getting smaller, front ends are getting higher, all that kind of stuff. But effectively on your time trial bike, what you're trying to do is, make yourself as small as possible whilst maintaining maximum power output. And that usually entails a slightly shorter crank because you're further into your hip hinged position. So depending on the functionality of your body and how far forward you can hinge from the hips, that kind of determines effectively what crank length you should probably run. The further you can forward, the more functionality you have, probably the longer crank you can run, a bit more torque going through the system at the lever rather than the gears, so you can apply a little bit more force through that medium rather than having to rely on your gears and have a shorter length of the crank, which is probably more appropriate for triathlon, because you have the small worry of a run after the bike ride. So what you're trying to do is still the same effect as what you're doing on your time trial. You're trying to make yourself as small as possible and as slippery as possible, whilst maintaining as much force output as possible, but comfort becomes a bit more of a priority, because depending on what distance you're doing, you're probably going to have to run, if you're riding a time trial bike, at least a half marathon, probably a marathon. And the key word there is run.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to be in for a long walk. So the differences between a time trial position and a triathlon position are vast.
Yeah.
And your crank length choice is really important for this as well. Because one, it's full gas for 10, 20 miles, whatever it is that you're doing. You can just like throw your bike against a wall and go for a bacon sarnie afterwards. The other one, you've got to park your bike and go for a jog. So, if you're, depending on kind of what you're looking for and what you're looking to do, is essentially the position you can maintain for the duration of your event at the desired output. And crank length can play a big part in that.
Yeah. And so if we think about body positions on the bike, if we think about a TT position, essentially we're hinged at the hip, and your kind of torso wants to be hinged as far forward and towards horizontal as possible.
Well, that's what we used to think. So what we now know is low is slow and narrow is fast.
Right.
So yeah, if you look at, I quite like watching the old time trials of Cancellara, and looking at his position was insane. But yeah, it's like very low, very hinged position. The back is essentially like flat at like 90 degrees, and it's a very kind of closed off hip position. It's like
the more you bend
forward, the more compression there is at the top of the stroke. The more that kind of like as the pedal comes over the top, the more stress there is on your hip.
Yeah, you have to lift your leg higher into your body.
It's essentially like doing a squat, but rather than going quarter way down, you're going like all the way down.
Yeah.
So that's a very posturally stressful situation.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes take away from the amount of force that you can produce.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of ways to combat that. One of them is crank length. So if you're shortening the length of the lever that you have to turn the gear, then it not only gets shorter at the bottom of the pedal stroke, so generally the saddle has to come up a little bit to kind of, assuming the position is good, to maintain the distance between the saddle and the bottom of the pedal stroke, which creates more space at the top, less flexion at the top of the stroke, more open hip angle. But it also affects the distance at 9 and 3 as well. It doesn't just get shorter at the top and the bottom, it gets shorter at each end. So this has an effect in where your saddle is placed relative to your feet as well. And this can play a part in opening the hips out even more if you kind of can move the position a bit further forward, if you have the stability to be able to deal with that. If not, you go backwards, you can get a bit more stability through your posterior chain on the saddle, usually without too much of a detriment to the hip angle.
Yeah, we'll get more into like kind of
that was a lot.
I mean, there's just so much here to unpack, but hopefully we'll get into a bit more about functionality and benefit a bit later on, and probably more in part 2. If you are a triathlete and you want to figure out or listen to a bit more about benefits of crank length and running off the bike, then have a look back at our previous kind of podcasts. And I actually did a webinar with Colin Norris of APB Works about tips to run off the bike, and there's some very specific kind of bike fitting considerations for being able to run off the bike, essentially because running is the opposite to riding. Like we're going from like a crouched, bent over, flexed hip position on the bike to an upright, open hip position on the run. So if you go from one extreme to another, then there's some specific demands in your body.
Running requires hip extension. The bike is essentially hip flexion.
But already you can just go from we talked about mountain biking and the demands of like crank length on mountain biking, which is torque, power production, stability, rock strikes, to triathlons where it's still a bike, you're still pedaling it, but we're looking at how your ability to hold a certain position, a very static position for a long time, your functionality around that.
Permission to speak, sir.
Yes.
You mentioned the word stability.
Stability.
On a time trial and triathlon bike.
Incredibly
important.
Incredibly important.
Because you are in a very, very posturally stressful position.
Indeed.
So if you can increase your stability and therefore reduce the amount of energy that it takes for you to hold your position for the duration of your event, then you're probably onto a win.
So stability kind of is key for a lot of things. And then road and gravel sit somewhere in between. So like the two ends of the spectrum be downhill mountain biking and then time trialing, and then everything else sits somewhere in between. Track racing's kind of interesting. Had a few kind of track races in recently.
It's been 165
since
the very beginning.
Since the dawn of time.
That was so that you had to have shorter cranks because you're on a banked.
You're on a banked
velodrome.
Is that right?
That's
Is that the
was,
main reason?
That's the
You
main
just so you
reason.
don't clip a pedal.
Yeah.
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 I just thought it was something to do with like cadence and being able to spin up to higher cadences.
Well, that's kind of a benefit, isn't it? That's like a plus.
Yeah.
I think that's more of a kind of a consequence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think they don't want to repair tracks every
And what about road bikes then these days? And what are we seeing these days in the studio?
Can I go? Sir, we are seeing
Might just get home.
Yeah. I mean,
So-
Pog rides 165.
Pog rides 165s and he does all right, but why? Right, so we were earlier watching the Giro and Pog slaying again, and he just looks super chill. But with road and gravel, you've got a bit more kind of leeway and crossover depending on the functionality of the rider. And I think this is a massively overlooked thing with crank length that determines perhaps what crank length you should ride is actually how does your body function? Not because Pog rides 165, so we should all ride 165 as well. It's how does your body function and interact with the other parts of the bicycle. So I've got a theory on this.
Go on then.
Should we make listeners tune into the next part of this episode?
We'll do this bit.
We'll do this
Okay.
bit. Yeah. So back in the day when cycling was a strange thing for you to do in the 80s, I think, I don't know, like a lot of kind of what I tend to see in the studio, which kind of warrants shorter cranks, is a lack of functionality in the body. It's not that it's kind of like you're going to get a benefit in like power transfer or stability or whatever. It's usually a problem solver.
Okay. And
Right.
what function are people
So
lacking?
lack of ability to rotate the hips forward into a true hip hinge. So pelvic rotation into like an anterior pelvic rotation, usually maybe as a result of tight or weak hip flexion, lower abdominals, or hamstrings which are kind of pulling the pelvis kind of into a more of a posterior rotation. I'm going to get some heat from my physio friends here. But like essentially lack of control of the pelvis to rotate forward to cover distance effectively from the saddle to the handlebars whilst being able to deal with the flexion at the top of the pedal stroke.
Okay. So
This is the nitty gritty of crank length, people.
yeah.
This is why we're here.
And what kind of similar movements would we usually require similar kind of demands like that?
So if you think about climbing stairs,
yeah.
right? So if you've got two flights of stairs next to each other, and they are both the same, and
Same height.
same kind of like depth of stairs,
Yeah.
and on one side you've got someone who's been asked to go up the flight of stairs 3 at a time,
Okay.
and then on the other side you've got someone who's going 1 at a time. So you've got on one hand you have to take a big step. It's like quite stressful for the body. Your knee is coming really high up towards your chest, and it's a lot of effort to get up one step.
Yeah.
Whilst your mate next to you is just like pitter-pattering up the steps, like a lot quicker, and it's a lot less stress on the body. So the other analogy is a squat. So if you think about a squat, you go like a quarter of the way through your range. It's pretty easy. You know, there's no stress there. You can hold that position for a long time. If you've got to go right down to the bottom and go to full range, there's a lot more stress going on there. And there's usually some compensations happening in order for your body to go through that range of motion. So if we can reduce the compensations that need to happen to achieve, you know, adequate kind of range of motion to deal with the flexion at the top of the pedal stroke, then that could be interesting for us as bike riders.
So you're basically saying like riding a long crank is a bit like trying to take 3 steps at once.
Yeah.
And so it has different requirements to a shorter crank, which would be a bit like going up a set of stairs 1 at a time.
Yeah.
So
Bad analogy, but I think you get my point.
yeah, and you know it's quite a good one because you know you can see that you can get to the top of the stairs with fewer kind of strides by using the longer crank or taking 3 at a time, but it requires more energy or force each step to kind of get there. Whereas you have to kind of step up each small step, like kind of quicker, in order to get up to the top of the steps.
So there's different stresses on different parts of your body. Yeah. So like you said, the longer the lever, the longer the crank, the more steps, the more distance you have to cover per step. So it's more muscular stress, more stress on the muscular part of the body because you're having to generate more torque at a lower cadence. But the shorter steps, shorter crank, it's easier on the muscles, but slightly more stress on your cardiovascular system.
Yeah. So if our muscles are generally quite tight or weak,
Let's say it for what it is, weak.
Yeah, weak.
Can't use that word anymore.
Then which way would you choose to get
which
up?
stairs are you taking? You're taking the short ones, obviously.
It sounds to me like the bike industry is way ahead of the stairs industry at the moment. Because, like, where are they? Where are they at?
The stairs industry is at standard
Sure,
stair
when you want
lifts,
standard
mate.
stair lifts, so that's e-bike. That's e-bike equivalent.
That's our future.
What you want
Stair
is like
lifts.
if money is no object, you get your stairs made to the same length as your cranks.
Well, the other analogy, you think about it, is using the stairs analogy. Imagine you had to walk up a flight of stairs for 6 hours, which is a long bike ride.
Or really, really long staircase.
Would you rather
Angel tube station?
Yeah. Would you rather walk up many, many smaller steps, or would you walk up some big steps?
Yeah, you walk the smaller ones every day of the week.
Well, it
depends,
it
doesn't
depends, doesn't it? But
that's how you feel.
Depends on your
on your physique.
on
And
your
if you're a
function.
giant,
yeah.
you're going to take many steps at a time.
But if you're a giant with really tight hamstrings,
Do you pitter patter?
exactly.
It'd be like one of those little puppies trying to learn to go up
Yeah.
steps.
so we're saying that bodily function, your ability to to hinge, to squat, how tight your muscles are, how strong you are, all have an effect on what might be the most effective crank length for your bike riding.
But it works the other way as well. If you're hypermobile and you have like epic mobility, but maybe not necessarily the coordination, strength, cycling specific coordination to control that mobility, crank length can help or hinder you there as well.
Yeah.
So it works both ways.
Yeah. So going back to your original, I think originally at the start of this podcast, you asked whether or not crank length, do taller people need longer crank lengths?
Yeah, I got ahead of myself, didn't I?
So I think the answer is
No.
yes, but it depends.
No, that word that is
word
no
so
and yes
well.
said exactly
Yeah.
the same time. That's essentially the answer.
Yeah. I was trying to be diplomatic. Matt says no. I said it
Diplomacy went out the
depends.
window ages ago.
The
I
answer is
think
always it depends.
the answer is always it depends. But if we're going to be kind of like a bit, put our head on the block a little bit, then no, it's not necessarily always the case that people with long legs need long cranks.
Yeah. I mean, I had a lady in who was over 6 foot in the other day, and she ended up on 155 cranks.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily, because of her height in particular. But you may, as a starting point, assume that, a taller person may, find better function on a longer crank. And that's kind of what the bicycle industry has assumed. It still works out bike sizing on like kind of rider height. And so all the components that it specs on a certain size of bike still come size relative to height, and so on. But that's where we start to run into kind of issues, especially at the lower end where, you get bikes like Canyon who are making 3 extra small kind of size bikes, which is great.
With 650B wheels.
650B wheels, so they've
thought about it.
they've recognised that shorter
They've
riders.
stopped doing that now.
No?
Yeah.
Are they still doing it?
Yeah, shorter riders might need smaller wheels, narrower handlebars. Do they need short?
Still
cranks?
putting 170mm cranks on. Bosh. Cheers, guys.
Yeah. And there's a myriad of other different kind of reasons why they do that. But yeah, you got to check the crank length.
Yeah.
Because more than likely, if you
how do you check your crank length?
How do you?
Usually, it's written on the crank just behind
There you
where
go.
your pedal's going. So keep an eye out for the little number.
What if you've rubbed it off?
You can't rub it off unless you're pedaling from the inside of the cranks. It's usually on the inside. But you can also measure them with a tape measure or a ruler.
Where do you measure from?
Where do you measure from? Centre to centre. So the middle of the hole where the pedal goes in to the middle of the hole where it sits in the bike.
There you go.
Unless you're campag and you place like the crank length on the very tip of the
Oh yeah, some people do that.
crank.
Where it will get rubbed off if you hit a
pedal.
curb.
Yeah, and
Which
it
most
always
people
does.
do. Yeah.
Thanks, campag.
But I think as well, like we were saying, with like road and gravel, you've got a bit more leeway, maybe, in potential crank length, because you aren't generally riding at the extremes of each end. So mountain biking, time trialing, the position's a bit more upright, but also you can affect torque a bit more by changing the gear. So, like if you're riding World Cup XC mountain bikes and you are on a super steep gradient and like you were saying before, your drivetrain's going to explode, so you can't change gear, maybe a longer crank might be better. So it depends on, lots of things, I think, is what we're saying.
Back to the whole thing, like one crank length is not necessarily the exact...
On each side?
Ideal. No, I mean, most people will have a range of crank lengths that they
Way's
can ride.
got different crank lengths on every bike he owns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how many different bike sizes?
Yeah, lots of different bike sizes.
Do you have different feet that you just pop on? Depending on how long your cranks are.
I wish I did. Different shoes.
You could, but it affects everything, doesn't it? It affects where you put your cleats and et cetera, et cetera. So.
But I think the key here is coming back to the hips. So, how your hips function and how everything from crank length to frame size to handlebar position to saddle position to the terrain that we ride on affects the angle at which our hips have to operate in, and also how much they get closed up by the leg as we kind of go through the pedal cycle. So really, it's everything that affects the hips that we're looking at. And as we've seen, that kind of comes, it's more than just bike position itself. It's the terrain. It's your function, and if we cannot control the hips, then we're going to run into issues at some point. And this is why, kind of testing crank lengths, figuring out crank lengths is tricky, and it's generally just being ignored, I think, unless you're at the pointy end of, performance, and then it seems warranted. But if you're doing any kind of length of riding or regularity of riding, then it's probably worth, preserving your hips.
Yeah. And how do you test it?
Well, maybe we should go into that in the next episode.
Cliffhanger.
Dun, dun, dun. But I think there's quite a lot of stuff that we've talked about, and we could break all of that down into kind of smaller episodes in itself. But hopefully that's given you a little insight into why crank length is important, and kind of where we are at 2024 with crank length, and why we've got to where we've got to. So tune in for the next episode, as we were rudely interrupted there.
What does do not disturb mean?
Yeah. But tune into the next episode, where we will get into more of the benefits of crank length, how you can start to test your different crank length, and where you should decide to put your crank length, and maybe some of the kind of barriers that people run into when they're thinking about crank length, and how we can kind of bust those kind of barriers apart. So, all right. Thanks, lads.
See you on the next one.
On to the next one.
Here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell all your friends about me. At Cycling Demystified on Instagram, tell everyone. And leave us a review on your podcast platform, whether it's Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, whatever. That would help us out a lot. Suffering from numb hands, tingling toes, and any other persistent discomforts when you ride? These are all signs that your bike fit could be improved. If you're bike fit curious, get in touch with Way or Matt by emailing info@foundation.fit or finding them on Instagram @FDN_bikefit. Finally, for all your bike servicing needs, custom dream bike or hand-built wheels, go to www.frequencycycleworks.com or find me on Instagram @frequencycycleworks. Until next time.